Hey folks, this is a SIG release meeting to discuss the POC of DEB and RPM packages on OBS. We do abide by the CNCF Code of Conduct, just that boils down to just to be kind to everyone. And this meeting is also recorded and uploaded to YouTube.
Okay, so the agenda that Jason wrote stated that this meeting is to have a walkthrough of OBS and features that will assist with some of the challenges related to our release process. So it seems the ball is in OBS's court.
Let me know who I should make co-host so they could share the screen.
It's me. It's Derek's.
All right, so you should be able to share your screen.
Okie dokie. Everybody can see it now?
Yep.
Okie doke. So build service is like Open Build Service is software we wrote since like 2006 now. It runs our whole complete distribution workflow. So it's not just about building packages, also the whole maintenance workflow, building appliances, and since a while now also Docker containers, which we will get back to in a sec. We can build for a lot of distributions, as you can see here. It's one of the open source projects where I help them to get packages working or keep them working. And so, yeah, we prefer if people build from source, and but we discussed it in the last meeting already. One thing we can do is hook up OBS to Git. The easiest approach is what we use here. It's a source service where we describe, we grab from this Git URL and this branch or tag, and then build a table from it, and it builds, again, all the distributions you see here. This is explained. No, not this one. This one. I can share all the links I have open later on. So you can have events triggered from GitHub to the OBS to trigger those builds. So for example, this one was triggered yesterday with a git push to master.
Hey, Derek's, real quick, just for the sake of the recording, would you mind making your screen a little larger?
You mean the font size?
Yes.
Whoops.
Thank.
Okay.
Well,
sorry.
Thank you.
I just yeah, the problem with the screen, it's my large screen, so yeah. I can choose a file again. So yeah, it's triggered via GitHub since a few weeks now. We have an additional workflow where you can also map different branches to different projects in OBS and different packages. So for example, you can have ISV Kubernetes release or CI where you do the daily trigger. And one of the advantages if you use that for snapshot builds or automated builds is we don't store actually the source code or huge blobs. We only store this repository and this revision was used for building, and so we don't waste any space for that. So especially for all your snapshots and daily things, I would really recommend going with one of those routes because it saves us a lot of space and also resources. Yeah. And as I mentioned already, we can also build containers. And the nice thing is, if, for example, if I have GitLab runner here, which is the package that builds the binaries for me, and when this package changes, all the containers on top get rebuilt automatically. So if you have an underlying package changing, all these things on top get rebuilt automatically, so we don't have to do manual things for that. And at the end, RPMs or depths get signed, they get published in a signed repository, and then also like distributed via our mirror infrastructure. So that would be the quick and easy overview. Is there any of those topics you would like to see more?
I think the big thing would be is what are your thoughts on ways that we could reduce the storage consumption with using the pre-built binaries?
Well, for the proof of concept, I would stay with your pre-built binaries because it's the easiest step to integrate into your process. We also have like the source service you saw here. We also have a source service that can download binaries for which are specified in the spec file or in the Debian sources. I mean, at least for the spec file, not sure about the Debian source, but and then stay with that for the proof of concept. But long term, especially for all those nightly builds, I would really say go for this features we have because it will make a lot of integration easier.
Yeah,
because
so
you can, for example.
Yeah,
yeah
so I completely agree with Darix here. The point is, if you download these binaries, they are basically handled as sources and they are stored. So that's absolutely fine for now. And we could even if you would have a package and download way too many or only temporarily binaries which are not supposed to clean to stay there forever, we could even clean up. If you would stick with pre-built binaries on the long run, we could have an implementation where we basically mirror or we have already an implementations to mirror binaries from external resources like containers or RPM repositories. So these are really handled then as binaries, and we could theoretically extend this to handle also your special form of binary. So all the foreign distributions, the non-SUSE distributions, the new ones at least, are used or transported by that. We could already use this mechanic for your builds. In case you would build containers, you could provide an external container with this pre-built binaries. But as far as I understood, you wanted to build RPMs and Debians, and then, yeah, that doesn't work.
Yeah, okay. And the other question that I would have, since we would be trying to tie this into automated tooling, what are the APIs or CLI tooling that we would have to be able to, upload those or, upload the new spec file, Debian package configuration pointing to the new binaries, and then kick off the builds and then monitor the status of those builds?
So I will do that if you want.
Okay.
So we have OC as our command line tool, which you can use, which is a little bit rendered after like Git or SVN. I mean SVN because it's really old already. Like rendered a build after SVN. So you have all those things. And one of the points we have for automation for listening for events, we have rabbit.opensuse.org, which is a simple AMQP where you can see events for your projects and packages when they get published and so on. There's documentation here. So you can hook into that so you don't have to poll on our site. So link is that. Okay. Yeah, down here.
Yeah, but OSC is using also a plain REST API. I mean, if you ask explicitly for an API, there is a REST API. There's some documentation, or you could even use OSC-D to see what OSC is doing, what kind of calls, and replicate this.
Yep.
I mean, if you maintain your content in some Git server, there are anyway multiple options that you just say build service, just follow this Git. So so you actually work in the tooling and you would just trigger events to OBS and let it building. And there are multiple. Yeah, this okay. What Derek's currently is showing, that's the newest way. This is that all the sources are really natively managed in Git, so not with these service files you see here, but all the spec files are natively maintained in Git. However, this is still work in progress, so that might be not 100% stable at the moment because we're still working on that. You're going into that direction, but that might be too early for you.
So the service files can not only grab a full Git, but it can also extract files. So you can have a spec in the DSC file, which you need to unpack. So we can do the dependency resolving out of the Git, and then everything else is maintained in Git, but we can use it for building.
Yeah, but the service files are the stable way. The current stable way, the SCM sync is the new way where you don't need a service file where really everything is managed in Git. That might be unstable at the moment. The service files is something what you could use today in a stable way. Just to be clear here.
And because you are asking for CI, so the OBS is not a CI service, right? So you have to think about it from the other perspective. This is actually more comparable to your SCM, so GitHub or GitLab or whatever, right? So you store some sources and some that might be binaries or build descriptions or whatever inside here. And then the build gets triggered automatically. And every time you update the sources, the build gets triggered automatically. So basically, it's not like a CI. The build you don't trigger by, or you can trigger, of course, also in some other ways, but usually by changing sources, right? And then you can have like in your SCM in GitHub currently, you could have different branches that are based on each other. So you can have your master branch, and then you can have test builds for this, or you can have an unstable branch where you prepare something and then you merge it back into the stable branch, so to speak. So I think the best way to think about this is about the OBS is it's an SCM. It's not a CI tool. So it's not something you can use it as CI tool, but it's basically the default mode is like your SCM.
Yep.
So I do have one question there.
Yep.
Because right now, where we are keeping like the Debian package configs and the RPM specs is in a separate repository than, say, the Kubernetes source code is. Is it possible using that service file to watch a different repository to trigger the build?
Well, so you configure basically you configure the triggering the same way you do, for example, if you use Circus CI, you tell in GitHub, please add Circus CI, please, and then here's the token you need, and here's how you trigger it.
I think the question was more like, can you stack if you go back to the service file, maybe?
Yeah.
Can you have more than one service OBS SCM? And the answer is yes. So you can pull from more than one repository, yes. So you could pull the binaries from the one and spec files from the others. It's possible.
Yeah. Yeah, it's possible, but this. Yeah, no, it's possible. You would need
If it's
to
broken, we
extract
will
the
fix
spec
it.
file. No, you would need to extract the spec file because
Yeah,
I mean, the
I
build
mentioned it
source
already.
would need to be, would need to know from where, but it's possible, yes.
So I mean, this is also fixable long term, Jason. Just a note. I think the ideal state is for the spec file to be to live in Kubernetes. We had initially it was initially in Kubernetes, but because because we're maintaining basically, n amount of release branches at any one time, it was drawn in so that we could easily make changes to the script without having, maybe someone's using the script from the development branch and expecting to get the same results that they would for 125 than as 124, and something's changed fundamentally in the script, right? So there was that. So I think there's a need to improve the tooling. kubepkg is a step in that direction. The idea being that you can there is a kind of two phases of the package creation. The first phase is generating what the spec file is altogether, right? And that could be just one part of our, we keep the tooling in k-release or elsewhere, and generate the spec file, get the spec file into the correct branch, target the branch within OBS.
Yeah, that's actually also something what we play with a new way, which is unstable, as I mentioned before, where people either basically fork a repository and put their changes on top of it and rebase it always. That's one possibility. Others try currently to reuse a foreign Git repository as a submodule and put their spec files and additional files in their own Git repository, and this is then directly used by OBS using the OBS sync mechanic. So I'm not sure if you are fine currently with a little bit unstable and that it's work in progress, then you might like this approach better, because then you don't need to write these service files. But as I said, that is currently unstable, and if you need something reliable for releases, then the service files might be better at the moment.
So, but in general, you would fetch from somewhere your build descriptions, and from somewhere your sources, which in your case would be a target tar with binaries or whatever, right? And then those would be stored in OBS, and then you can, inside OBS, connect it to your SCM, have some workflows. So it's not a CI service because the questions keep going into this direction.
Yeah, it's only an CI service if you can run the CI inside the package or container building. So it has limits, and there you don't have network, so that rules out quite a lot of CI.
Yeah, this is another point. All our builds are disconnected from network, so I'm not sure how much stuff you download during your normal Docker-based build. So if you would switch to a source-based build, we would need to, for example, have a service that grabs Golang rendering. We have in preparation, and similar things for like if you need npm or yarn install before you can run the builds, then we would also need to move that into a service, but there are solutions for that. Because you're not the only one that's needing it.
Yeah, just as a bit of background, so what build service is aimed to do is always keep binaries and sources in a clean build state in sync. So when a binary is changing, which is required for another build, it will trigger builds. Or when the sources are changing, it will trigger builds usually. but only the affected ones are triggered. So that's, I mean, the main reason why we did it in that way 20 years ago was that fixed pipelines, large fixed pipelines for building a distribution are not doable. It would be way too large, and the fixed pipeline would slow you down a lot. So only the so when you check in as a compiler, of course, everything is rebuilding. But if you check in, let's say the Qt library, then only the KDE desktop gets rebuilt, for a simple example. And therefore, yeah, one gets a consistent state as soon as possible. So that's the difference to some other setups with fixed pipelines and so on.
So just to give you an idea, our distribution, so the OpenSUSE distribution, consists of 14,582 packages currently, and that is only source packages. So those might generate double the amount in binary packages. So it's not like a CI pipeline where you can manually say, oh, if I change this, then this has to change, and then this. But you have chains that are like insanely long, and basically are unmanageable by humans, I would say, or you would go crazy. So basically, this is the default use case that we have built OBS for, is that you have one repository of many packages that have connections to each other, like dependencies, conflicts, suggestions, and stuff like this. So.
And for you as an ISV, you have usually the choice if you build against the GA state of a distribution, or if you want to also include the maintenance updates. So if you have some parts which depends, for example, on the exact kernel, because you built a kernel module, then you could retrigger out, or just by the setup of your build, it would retrigger automatically when the kernel is changing, because some distribution is releasing a new kernel. It would also retrigger your kernel module build, just as an example. But you can also always say, okay, we don't care. Our stuff is so independent. We are so high level. We just build against the GA. That is the oldest state, and that would work then on any update level of the system. So that's
Hopefully
also absolutely valid. Yeah.
I think it would be helpful if you could go through the access control bits.
Well, each project you can, or each package you can say which users have access and at which level. It's basically, if you look here, this is the raw version, and only maintainers can change things in a project. You can set that on a project level, on a package level.
Are there any instances where you can defer the authorization authentication to other systems, say GitHub login, for example?
Not on our instance, no.
Yeah. Well, there are certain operations work via tokens. So for instance, if you want that GitHub triggers you a rebuild, then you can generate a token and tell that GitHub. So that's what Darix is currently showing here in the documentation, I think. Or you could also do it on command line. So if you have own custom scripts, you could do this manually.
But you can't use GitHub as an authorization source. So you would need to create a new account with us.
Yeah. Are the tokens bound to users, or can they be considered bot or service accounts?
Well, there's a real account associated with a token. So you would need to have a SIG release account, for example, and that user can create tokens, and those tokens then can be used to trigger actions. And tokens cannot only be global, but you can say, for example, this token can only trigger packages in this, can only trigger actions in this project and package.
And only this, and only a certain action also. So it's bound to user, project package, which would be the objects in OBS, and action. Yeah. So everybody who basically, one of the basic operations is, right, you update your sources and your build fails, right? And you want to see, is this flaky, or is this always failing, and you want to trigger a rebuild, right? Then you can have a token that gives the right to rebuild a certain package for your user account, and then hand this token out to whatever you want to. So be it a script, another person, or whatever.
Yeah, but you can also work the other way around. If you don't want to bind a certain package to a token, you can say it in general, then it's still bound to the user, and wherever you add the user to the project or package, you can trigger that then. But then you need to, I mean, the remote instance, GitHub or whatever would need then to add the information, which project, which package. That would be different, by the way, with the upcoming SCM sync mechanic. Their build service knows which Git repository is bound to which package, and when the Git repository is changing, all instances are updated. But that, as I said, that's in experimental state at the moment.
And maybe another thing, this is like handing out the keys to the castle for a certain door or a certain operation, right? Or you can handle out your whole key as token, or it's basically the same as if you share the password, right? And we also have another mechanism where you can use the usual CI workflow, right? You have some YAML file in your GitHub that defines the workflow that you can trigger by such a token. So the workflow being, okay, there's a new PR, we need a new test build, so we create a new test repository, branch the packages in it and the whole build setup, and then we trigger this and report the status back to the commit status on your SCM, so on GitLab or GitHub or wherever you are. And then basically you have your workflow definitions in, like you probably have CI and also CD workflows in your somewhere, some YAML file, right? Stuff like this is also possible. So this is the way how you can use OBS as CI. So you can have the package build CI'd, right? And yeah, the other stuff is like operating in OBS. Maybe I can show you this. That might be interesting, more interesting thing than the screenshots.
The question is what you want to do. If you want to, I mean, if you would just want to do a simple build and release it, then this is overhead. But if you want to integrate all kind of user interaction with pull requests, then it's interesting. So not sure if you show you too many different options at the moment.
Yeah, so I think we would minimize that usage for Kubernetes pull requests. There are several pre-submit checks, and it takes a reasonable amount of time. Where I think the system as it exists today, basically we build a variety of artifacts, and then the last mile is essentially building the Debian RPMs and then moving them to the appropriate apt and yum repositories. So as much as possible, it would be ideal that the system is disconnected from any pre-submit verifications. Really, ideally there's some service token for some bot token that's running in the context of the Google Cloud build or something, and eventually shipping off to triggering from Google Cloud build and having the artifacts being shipped from OBS. I would see the user tokens as a fallback, a break glass scenario.
Yeah. And I was definitely thinking having users have access to OBS in order to troubleshoot things when they went wrong, but having that could be a limited set of permissions compared to the general token that is kicking off the builds.
I
Yeah, so
mean, a normal
whatever-
user
what-
can go, Adrian.
Yeah, but always, I mean, everything what you would do in build service would by default be public, right? I think that's no problem for you. But that means also that everyone with also if you create any account, you can check out the stuff you submitted, and you could do a local build, or you branch it into your own workspace. So, but usually you do a local build if you really want to dig into deep to debug something, because you can't do this very well remote. Depends on the problem and the user, of course.
So I didn't really go for this meeting. Let's show how we would exactly implement the proof of concept. It's like show them all the possibilities so you can pick and choose what you want for your proof of concept for later on. Like you did say, proof of concept, we go with the simple download binaries, we implement that. And later on we go, for example, okay, now we want RPMs and depths for master. Here's how we do that.
Yeah,
So
I think
just
that makes
showing
sense.
all the possibilities so you can do an informed decision and not later on get to the point where like, oh, wait, we could have done it like that. That would have saved us a lot of time.
I think the other question I have, would it be possible to run through the signing workflow? How that works?
There is actually not really a workflow. Every binary which is built gets signed, and on publishing it gets signed, and it gets signed based on your namespace you're operating. So if you want to have, for example, a different signing key for your development build and your release builds, just assuming, what would you do is you would put a different key to your, or other way around. If you use the release mechanics of OBS, you could have 2 or 3 projects, one for your builds and another one for the released stuff, and maybe even an intermediate in between for testing. So usually the first project is always building, then you release it, or we do it often in this way, then we release it to a QA testing project. And release means always copying sources and binaries over. And a third one could then be the final approved one. And you could, on each of these projects, you could have a different key. So that means if it gets moved over, it would also get re-signed. Was this understandable?
So there's no manual step in signing. It's all, you define a key for your project. Everything is automated.
Yeah. The only things what you can do regarding signing is requesting the public key, saying you want to extend its lifetime, or saying please refresh a key. Give me a new key for the project. That's basically on purpose the only operations we support, because the keys are really locked away in the best possible way, encrypted on disk, and yeah.
Yeah, I think that was the point I was getting at, in that the individual user doesn't really have anything to do with the signing. It's a separate process that is controlled more tightly by OBS.
Yep.
Yeah, and if you want to have I'm not sure if you want it, but if you want to have different keys for released binaries and for development binaries, then the only way is basically to do it via the release process, because then it gets moved over to another project, and this could have a different key. And usually only keys gets only created by OBS, and you would maybe sign it with your key, but we wouldn't hand out ever the private key. If you insist that you give us a private key, we could also manually import it. It would have the, yeah, so that's not what we usually offer, or only for special projects that we import a private key. But usually it's better if that our service has created it and you say, okay, we approve that this is the official key.
And just to make a complete picture, like everything we release as a distribution is tested with OpenQA, which does all things you would imagine, like even graphical installation. Can I click in Just or KDE? Is the Firefox working? So when we release our rolling release distro, we are relatively sure that it's more or less working. And I mean, yep.
One other question that I would have is assuming we fronted everything with the vanity URL on our end, how difficult would it be to migrate from the hosted OBS solution to like a self-hosted OBS instance?
You might lose history if you copy packages over, but other than that, it's an easy peasy.
Yeah, but we could transfer this in a way. I mean, we could give you the content in a way that you could not lose the history.
Yeah.
No.
On
yeah,
admin level we can, but not the user way.
Yeah, it's harder to do. So what's not implemented since a long time is a replication of a project from a remote instance. We wanted to have this since a long time, but we don't. But in this special case, we could transfer it. Basically, we could provide a tarball and you could import it, and then you only would need to use the same usernames, basically. Otherwise, you would a bit in trouble. But
All right. I think I'm out of questions. Anybody else? No. All right.
I think you know, the obvious, and apologies if this was answered in a previous meeting, but what's the best way to get started?
Started with what? With the real proof of concept or just using OBS?
The real proof of concept.
You set up a meeting and we walk through it. Like I would do it as here we do it like a workshop. This is OSC. Here's how you run it. Here's how you get your project, and then we start implementing it.
yeah, but you could start at any time by going to build OpenUser or create an account and try to upload your spec file and your stuff. And yeah. But if you get Derek's as supporter, then you can be happy and should use the chance.
And I think the other aspect is what I've gathered right now is the way that we're defining our spec files. It references the binaries directly, and we need to make sure that we kind of refactor that a bit so that it works properly with the sources configuration in OBS. Get those.
Like as I said, we have a source service called like we have, if you see here, service name OBS STM, we have a download file as service as well. So in the first proof of concept, we use download file for like if you want just let's say 125 RPMs built by OBS and depths, we would just use that.
And there's also download files. So if you define your remote files as sources in the RPM spec files, you would only need to adapt it there, and the download files would automatically download it based on the URLs from the spec file.
Yep. No extra work.
All right.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the best course of action would be to schedule a follow-up where we can go ahead and start trying to manipulate what we have and get it building within OBS. Is that what I'm hearing?
I would actually say it might make sense for the team to kick the tires in team and then schedule a follow-up to ask the questions about where we got stuck.
I mean, we can. That's why I'm saying I can give you get you rolling so you don't get stuck. Like I know we have Corner. It's a very powerful tool, but we have some cliffs to get into it. So I'm happy to help.
And for sure, you can do this in meetings, but I mean, we have a Slack channel now. We ourselves have an IRC channel. We have a mailing list. So basically, there are many places where you can ask questions, and we have a whole community of packages around this, right? I mean, in the Build OpenSUSE org, you have around 5,000 people who package every week. So there are many people who can answer questions. We don't have to limit this to meetings, I would say.
Yep.
I would say you start out, and then if something else is up, you ping us in your Slack.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. I like the idea of moving this more towards a little bit more async communication.
And I mean, even if you don't use OBS for the packages in the end, you can use it to build your containers for your workflows. So.
All right. Well, thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks for the time, everyone.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording.